After I did my senior Cambridge in Rishi Valley, I guess I was 15 and a half, something in that range. And my father gave me an opportunity. The person who was the partner, that Pearce Duff, if you remember at the very beginning, there was that thing that he did, where he had this company at the very beginning, which my grandfather started. Well, they suddenly sent my father, enough money for me to go to school in England, because schoolmasters, they don't earn very much money. So that gave my father an opportunity. I got the opportunity because it came at the right time. So I went to a public school in England for 2 years, and I did what was still called the A-levels, because you had to do the A-levels before you could go to university. And I had become more interested in the hard sciences, the physics, as opposed to biology. And so I went to the University of Manchester to study electrical engineering with a focus at the world had begun to start to think about using computers not just to print reports, but to control things. Steel mills, it's called process control, controlling the process, but using digital or analog techniques to do that. So I went to Manchester University, and while I was there, and towards the end, Westinghouse Electric, which was at that time, there were two big US companies in this business, General Electric and Westinghouse Electric. And there was a shortage in the United States of engineers with the kinds of things that we were doing at Manchester, automation and control and stuff like that. So they were recruiting at British universities, and I wanted to see what my plan was always to come back to India, but I also wanted to see the world, right? So when Westinghouse offered me a job, and of course in those days, when you converted dollars into rupees, it seemed like a lot of money. And so I said, yes, I'd like to go. But I haven't been home to India for many years, because when I was in school in England, again, expense, I was there for 3 years before I went home when my father was dying. That was the first time that I went back to India. Subsequent to that, I told Westinghouse, I'll come, but you'll have to pay for my fare from India, not from England. I said, sure. So I left to go to India. And that's when I found out that in those days, my father was British, and in those days, I just got a British passport. My father just filled out the forms. I didn't know any different. I got the passport that my father gave me. And of course, it made it very easy to go into England if you had a British passport. So when I came back, I just thought, well, there shouldn't be any problem by going to America. I have a British passport. Well, it turns out that didn't work in America. It depended where you were born, and I was born in India. So I came in those days under the Indian quota system. And the Indian quota system said, yes, you can get an immigrant's visa, but it's going to take you 9 years. So I said, I'm not going to wait 9 years to go to America. So when I came back to India, IBM had just come to India. And as it turned out, the apartment that my aunt was in, the floor above was where they were throwing some sort of a cocktail party, and the head of the new IBM was there. And so I was there at this cocktail party just saying hello. And this guy says to me, well, what are you going to do? And I told him my story. He said, well, why don't you join IBM? So I joined IBM in India. So I was in IBM for 3 years. And then I suddenly get this letter from Westinghouse, do you still want to come? We've got you a visa. So I was doing well at IBM, so I went to the general manager, who was a German. And he said, well, I know you're doing very well here. You've got all kinds of opportunities, but I can understand why you would like to go and see what America is like. So I understand if you want to resign. So I resigned, and I went to the States. Of course, my plan had always been to come back. But unfortunately, like all of you may have some children or friends or whatever, you go there and before you know it, you get caught up in doing what you're doing there and your life begins there, and suddenly, 10 years has gone back, 15 years has gone by, I marry an American, and before you know it, those ideas start to disappear. But I stayed connected to India because the Blue Mountain School, I was the chairman of the trust that ran the Blue Mountain School, so I would come with my wife, who was an educator, so she was on the board as well, and we would come every year. But about 5 or 6 years ago, I don't quite understand what exactly happened, but the Indian government began to make it very difficult for non-Indians to be members of educational trusts. I mean, maybe there were some people using trusts to make money or whatever. I mean, we certainly weren't making money, I'll tell you that. But it became so complicated to be continuing on the trust. We decided that we would still come to, as often as we could, to come to India, but not as often as we used to. We used to come every year, and that's what happened. So while I was, after, I'm 82 now, so in the last time I was here was when Bajrang and I met. It was the 125th anniversary of my father's birth at the Blue Mountain School. So Bajrang was there from Netarhat. We had a...
In that, Amarnath,
and he was there, Dar was with you.
Who was there with you in Sindhya?
And he came with him. Then there was another man who went to Sindhya school, and then when my father started Rishi Valley, he came to Rishi Valley. Dev Mohanta. So he was there, and then a bunch of old boys from Blue Mountain, and we just had a celebration to celebrate his life. And subsequent to that, I began to sort of think, I'd like to know more about how it all happened. So I began to spend time trying to trace the history and see how did it happen. And so as I begin to dig into this, I start to find out this thing, I just find out more and more and more, and it became a fascinating story. For example, I found out that my mother, now first of all, my mother made history by becoming the second Hindu to marry a Brahmin to marry an Englishman. But Malti, when she was a Patwardhan, when she was married to the Patwardhan, to the Patwardhan family, she was part of the Indian freedom movement and focused on women, and went to America and went all over Europe, talking about sort of like the suffragettes. You remember the women were trying to get the vote and all that kind of stuff. She was much more involved than I realized. And then, of course, she had this rather colorful life. She divorces a prince and then marries him, so I began to find out about this side of the family. And then the third sister, Sushila, ends up running the Planned Parenthood Federation for all of Southeast Asia. So, they're all extraordinary women, and what was the basis of it all? My grandfather saying, no dowry, but you will get an education. And I think that is what changed their lives. Because in those days, women were not, they weren't treated that way. The money, education tended to go to the men.